County Clerk is sending paperwork to an FBI special agent following a subpoena. The order was handed down by a federal grand jury, and that jury is investigating efforts to overturn the 2020 election.
The Dane County Clerk is one of several across the country receiving a subpoena. NBC 15's Colton Molesky spoke with the clerk before paperwork was submitted earlier today.
John Maria, the subpoena requires the clerk to submit any form to and from and involving the Donald Trump campaign going from June 1st of 2020 through January 20th of 2021. Clerks in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin received subpoenas. When I talked with the Dane County Clerk, he said he was surprised to receive the subpoena.
I was surprised. The November 2020 election just keeps on giving, so it's, yeah.
Dane County Clerk Scott McDonald, one of several across the country to receive subpoenas from a federal grand jury investigating efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election.
And we've got everything together. We'll send it over today.
The subpoena outlines a list of 19 names requesting any communication with the listed individuals, but also requesting any communication in any form to, from, or involving former President Donald Trump's campaign.
When you first read it, it sounds like they're compelling you to come to D.C. on Friday. But when we reached out to them, they were like, no, just send us what you have, and then we'll go over it, and then we'll call you.
Director of the Public Defender Project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School, John Gross, says the point of the subpoenas is to find if pressure was put on clerks during the election.
The type of communication urging a county clerk to find votes, right, or a Secretary of State to find votes for Donald Trump, which was the case in Georgia.
As for what's next, Gross anticipates going over the documents will take some time.
The goal here is to see if there was a conspiracy to overturn the election and to defraud the United States and interfere with the peaceful transition of power.
John Gross adds this could be viewed as an attempt to defraud the United States, an attempt to interfere with governmental administration, or even a seditious conspiracy, the most serious charge. He anticipates the investigation's next steps will be held close to the vest as they proceed. In studio, Colton Molesky, NBC 15 News.
It's important to note there have been multiple investigations into the 2020 election, and there has been no widespread voter fraud found in Wisconsin.